Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and I'm a minute late, but thanks for hanging in there. I hopefully won't have more technical difficulties as the day goes on, the hour goes on. Hopefully, we won't be here all day. So, today's question and answer session, I will summarize the two videos that were released this week. I'm open to other questions on those topics, on ADHD more broadly or mental health in general. I will give a shout out to the subreddit under Dr. John Kruse, if that's a better forum for some people to discuss some of the topics we bring up here on ADHD. And I also I believe it was Beth who brought up the question about bone cell migration and how that's affected by stimulants. That was not on my radar. It does seem to be a real issue, and I can't comment more till I actually do the research, and hopefully there's enough out there to have a full video on. So the videos that and one last shout out is on the Thursday, the 29th. I don't have the time in front of me. I will be giving a presentation in front of a Zoom presentation to the Manhattan ADHD group. They broadcast nationwide and have some of the top ADHD researchers in the country. So I'm honored to be invited to talk to them. It will be on personality disorders and ADHD. So there's a couple of different videos. I've talked about borderline personality disorder, narcissism, perfectionism, all mushed together. So the two videos released this past week, one was a re-recording, sound jiggering of our sleep monitors, useful or helpful, and the other was a review critique of the New York Times article, Are We Thinking About ADHD Wrong? So in terms of sleep monitors, my take is that they can be helpful in some instances to generally give you an idea of what's going on with different stages of sleep. They are not very accurately recording what is a specific sleep stage. So accurate recording requires EEG monitoring of what's going on in your brain. Usually involves measures of breathing, measures of oxygen saturation, measures of movement in your eye movement and body movement with different EMG electrodes. So the watches, phones, other devices are usually just using a heart rate monitor and an accelerometer, a movement detector to get a crude estimation of someone's sleep stages. And what I found with my Garmin watch here, it has a very, very poor correlation with when I think I'm awake, what I think is going on with my sleep. And I've also seen people sort of overly focused or worsen their sleep by focusing too much on their sleep metrics. So it might be helpful, but that's all I'll say there. The New York Times review article, so it's an article by Paul Tough in April, New York Times Sunday Magazine. And his question he posed, are we thinking about ADHD the wrong ways? And he starts out by presenting that there's a host of research that our clinical, real-world public conceptions of ADHD aren't matching or consistent with, which is a good and valid point. But then he goes on throughout most of the article to be attacking research and misinformed or inaccurate in his attacks and sort of cherry picking certain studies and not putting them in a proper context. And pretty much seems to be creating the impression that ADHD isn't a real or valid concept, and repeatedly compares ADHD to diabetes as sort of a valid, real body condition. And yet many of the statements he makes about diabetes or ADHD are just wrong and inaccurate. And there are many more similarities than differences. I've written a Medium article, which will come out tomorrow, on that angle of it. But I do think the two big points he tries to make, which I think are obscured by his writing rather than illuminated by it, are valid, and I would agree with him, even though the researchers like Russell Barkley and others have known about these for years. They don't seem to really have penetrated to the broader mental health world and to treatment clinics and into some of the patient groups themselves. And those two big points are ADHD does exist on a spectrum of severity. And the other one is that even though there is a strong genetic component to ADHD, it is subject to environmental factors as well. So I'm happy to jump into that in more detail if anyone wants to. Hi, Dennis, and Dennis has a question, so I will jump to the questions right now. Yeah, so Dennis says, his general practitioner says that autism and Asperger's syndrome are entirely different disorders from a pathophysiologic standpoint, and that over time autism worsens, whereas AS improves. Is that true? So there's two very different questions embedded in there. One is so right now by official nomenclature and I mean officially Asperger's is part of the autism spectrum. It is something individuals who tend to be on the milder end of that spectrum. So by definitions, that statement would be inaccurate. And is it possible that some people who are more profoundly affected by autism are more likely to be more resistant? I wouldn't say in general things worsen over time. It's just that the developmental expectations, if you're sort of stuck at locked into one developmental stage or development is derailed, you are getting further behind your peers with time. So in that respect, it's getting worse. But in terms of your absolute capabilities, most people with autism aren't deteriorating through the course of their life. So there's a couple different, I would argue, misconceptions there. But a deeper question in there is that in this autism spectrum, is it really one spectrum or one thing that is varying in severity, or is it a cluster of different things? And maybe even though there may be lots of overlap, it's possible that there is an entity at the milder end of the spectrum, which is distinctively different. I am not aware of any genetic studies, any brain activity studies, any looking at eye movements and seeing how social interactions are avoided or not attended to or other. I'm not aware of any data. There may be some that suggest that autism or the Asperger's syndrome is distinctly different pathophysiologically. I'm not aware of that, but there, I'll leave that at that. So thanks, Max. Max has provided the link to the Reddit site and the information to the Zoom lecture. We will be posting, there's a link to the Zoom. I think if you go to the Manhattan Adult ADHD Support Group website, they will also have it accessible there, but we'll get the link to that talk. Again, it's on the 29th, Thursday. I'm not sure what time because I'll be crossing time zones anyway. It's, I think around, it's early evening New York time. So AJ asks, is that something I need to be doing? Wanting to know if he should be getting labs regularly while he's on Strattera. It seems like referring to something else, but I'm not seeing a previous question. So different people have different approaches to lab work and getting, I think most of American medicine, not just psychiatry, but general medicine, is overly reliant on lab testing. And a lot of it is cover your ass thinking that you don't want to miss a very rare problem and get sued. And although so many tests aren't even looked at these days, I think by ordering lots of tests, you're increasing the likelihood you've neglected something that should be attended to and that isn't flagged properly and you get sued. What I'm getting to is that not just in psychiatry, but in general medicine, a thorough history, asking someone what's really going on and what they're feeling and what makes it worse and better and when it came up most often gives you the biggest chunk of diagnostic information you're going to have. So there are certain medications in psychiatry. So we know the rate of metabolic disorder with our antipsychotics, particularly Seroquel, quetiapine, and olanzapine, Zyprexa, but all of them to some extent have some risk for metabolic syndrome, which means it changes how your body processes fats, it changes how your body processes sugars. And the easiest way to monitor that is weight gain, and many people do gain weight. It's a minority, but it's a very large minority, gain weight on those drugs and gain it fairly rapidly. So weight gain is one screening tool, but we also know that there are some people with metabolic syndrome, again, who become full-blown diabetics from those drugs. It's a small percentage, but not negligible. Some percentage you do without gaining weight. So weight isn't a perfect marker. So that's a class of drugs where absolutely regular monitoring of blood tests is indicated. If you're on lithium, absolutely, because lithium has a rate of at least 1 out of 1,000 in women per year of destroying their thyroid. Unless you're monitoring, you're way behind the 8 ball by the time thyroid symptoms are showing up. Lithium can also affect the kidneys. At too high a dose, it's neurotoxic, but a third of the people after 20 years on lithium are showing kidney damage. So there are certainly medications where I would say, yes, it's required and appropriate, but the rate of any side effects that are going to be detectable by blood monitoring that aren't detectable by observation or symptoms with Strattera atomoxetine, I'm not sure what you would be looking for, or why you would want to do that. So again, I should say what I'm saying here is for informational purposes only. There may be factors of your own individual history, your own individual health. There may be drug combinations, or maybe other reasons your treatment team thinks it's a good idea to, in your individual case, monitor blood levels while on Strattera. But in a general sense, I'm not aware of any reason to do so. So Max is bringing us back to the New York Times Review, and Dr. Russell Barkley, who is one of the preeminent and deservedly so figures in ADHD research over the last 3+ maybe 4 decades, on his YouTube channel, devoted 4 separate videos to dissecting the Paul Tough New York Times article on ADHD. And so Max's question is, Barkley seemed to imply that the intent of the author was to misinterpret information and omit research, even comparing some arguments to ones used by Scientology. Do you think the article was bad faith? I'd say there were I'm always hesitant to attribute motives until or unless someone repeatedly tells us fairly directly what their motives are. And I also think philosophically, much more goes wrong on this earth because of stupidity, ignorance, partial knowledge, rather than overt malice. So there could be intent, and it doesn't mean, if you truly believe mental health conditions are not real conditions, they're just a product of our society and we should treat them differently, that view, I think, is inaccurate. I think it harms people, but I wouldn't attribute that to malice or to evil intent. So there are many points in there Paul Tough makes implications, and particularly I've dissected some of them and comparing. So he talks, I'll pick out one example. He goes on and on about most kids with ADHD and stimulants are non-compliant with them. They skip doses, they stop taking them completely. And he suggests very strongly, doesn't say it directly, that shows that it's not a real condition, because if it were real and it was helpful, then the kids would take them. And this reminds me, I had a colleague, I didn't go to lots of drug company lunches, but there was a spate of years I went to several. Every single different drugs, different companies, mostly ADHD focused, every lunch or dinner get together this psychiatrist went to, and he was a child and adult psychiatrist. He would bring it up as sort of a novel observation he just made that all of his child patients hated being on medications, rebelled against it, quit, didn't like it. And yet all of his adult ADHD patients clamored to be on it, wanted it, liked it, appreciated it. And he sort of proposed to the different speakers, is this a physiologic change that happens? Is it a psychological change? He didn't even articulate things that well. And I don't recall a single speaker actually taking up or really addressing his question. And maybe it was more a point to be making a point rather than asking a real question. But I think it's a common phenomena. And again, so Paul Tough keeps comparing ADHD to diabetes. And if he had paid any attention, there's an extensive literature about adolescents with diabetics and how often they don't follow dietary regulations. They skip taking their insulin. They stop doing it. Does that mean insulin doesn't work in juvenile diabetics either, and the medical model behind diabetes is wrong? No, the thinking by analogy is so wrong on so many levels throughout the article. But I think it's more through ignorance. I think he's trying to help. I would say the New York Times, and I'm trying to remember the author of the book, ADHD Nation. There have been several prominent health writers for them who have been very clearly and much more directly opposed to the ADHD diagnosis and treating it as quackery or nothing really there. I'd say you could certainly interpret what Paul Tough was saying in that realm. What came across to me more was that he talked to a small group of people. Again, I think his underlying point is really good and valid, but I'm not sure his logical reasoning and critical reasoning are applied in a conscientious and consistent way. There, that's my assessment. So Jen has been on Adderall for over 5 years and has gained 40 pounds. So I guess there's a couple different things. In general, 40 years ago, people with ADHD, and it was mostly kids at that stage, tended actually to be underweight, which fit with being hyperactive, expending lots of calories. The statistics for the last several decades are adults or children with ADHD are more likely to be overweight, are more likely to be obese. Some of that seems to be, even though hyperactivity is an element of ADHD, the amount of sedentary time is higher, and the amount of organized activity or exercise is lower among those with ADHD. Stimulant medications, including Adderall, have been used for decades as appetite suppressants, and for many people, they do. Many people, that appetite suppressant, and so the initial response is often a loss in weight, but most people become tolerant of that appetite suppressant effect, or it's minimal to begin with, so that can't be counted on. And there's also a body of research just looking at how much energy is expended by fidgeting. So and there's not been rigorous study on this specific angle, although I think, at least for some people, it's going to be valid. If you are fidgeting much less because you are more calmly focused on your work, and again, whether fidgeting is actually helping or promoting certain brain processes, it seems to. But if you're fidgeting less, that could be a mechanism by which being on a stimulant medication actually causes less energy expenditure, and the result of less energy expenditure is weight gain. And there's lots of people in the diet world who sort of attack as dinosaurian the view that food intake or exercise output have anything to do with weight gain. And at the level of physics, those are the big factors. Body basal metabolic rate is one, but again, how many calories are going in, how many are being burned, that is at a level of physics what contributes to weight gain or loss or stability. Now, does that hide or obscure the fact that many people or two different people could eat the same amount of food and it could have a markedly different effect on their bodies? Absolutely. But it doesn't get you away from calories in, calories burned are going to equate to weight gain or weight loss. So Jen is also pointing out that medications can help with aspects of ADHD, but there can still be social challenges. And even when ADHD medications help with some of the symptoms of ADHD that can contribute to social problems, it's seldom that they completely eliminate all symptomatology. So Max is forwarding a Reddit comment or question by Significant Club, and who asks, where does the autism spectrum start? And they know a lot of people, mostly men, who think may have a bit of autism, but don't think enough for a diagnosis. And sort of the follow-up or related question, is there a diagnosis for people who fall right below the starting line for autism spectrum? Something like the DSM will define autism. They may acknowledge it's on a spectrum, but if you're on the spectrum, the concept there is if you have any degree of it, you are on the spectrum, even if you wouldn't meet criteria for an autism diagnosis. I can say that again, or I can say it regarding ADHD. ADHD has a specific cutoff of 5 symptoms that are in excess for your age and social group and are causing distress or dysfunction. Clearly, if you have 3 or 4 symptoms, you could be having problems from your ADHD-ishness, but officially you do not have ADHD, but you are on the autism spectrum. Or you could just be displaying some symptoms because everyone occasionally forgets something or interrupts other people or gets distracted by something in the environment that they shouldn't be attending to. So you can have some symptoms and not be on, I would say, the spectrum, but almost by definition, the spectrum means that there will be people who aren't meeting full definition of the condition. And a good point that Dr. Barkley made in his discussion of the Paul Tough article is that when we have a condition that's on a spectrum, and that could be diabetes, it could be hypertension, it could be ADHD, it could be autism, the fact that we do have a cutoff, and the cutoff to some extent is arbitrary. It means we are using a judgment call to say this condition exists on a spectrum of severity, but we're saying things on this side of it are officially a condition and things on this side. So right now we have pre-diabetes, which isn't diabetes, but it means you're getting close and you should be probably doing lifestyle things to change your situation. So again, arbitrary means a group of experts decided for reason X, Y, or Z that the line should be here. Usually the arbitrariness is scientifically based. So it's based on, let's look at lifetime problems accruing from ADHD. And we know, problems with lower income, more, arrests for speeding, more car accidents, more X, Y, or Z outcomes are strongly associated with scores of 5 symptoms or more. Does that mean some people with 2 or 3 symptoms aren't getting into those same problems? They are. But it's the association is strong with such problems once you get to 5, and it's considerably weaker below that. But you could make a case that maybe it should be 4 or maybe it should be 7. So there's an arbitrariness, which doesn't mean a meaninglessness. So Jen thinks is pointing out other possible reasons that while being on Adderall, she still gained weight, and that her experience seems to be that while Adderall helps her be more focused, then she needs more sugar either to keep going, or she is more focused on getting sweet snacks, or so Max also brings up that a lot of the arguments from the ADHD New York Times article, many of them borrowed from the Scientologists, are, there's certainly naive and simplistic and sort of contrasting nature versus nurture. And as Max points out, and I've said many times, biology has to express itself in an environment, and that environment has an impact on how it's being expressed. So epigenetics is part of what's going on. I mean, epigenetics is specifically how your genes are being modified, turned on or off. But even separate from epigenetics, the environment matters. So I'll take an example. And in the brave, happy world of neuropsychiatry, once we know what it causes a condition, it sort of disappears from psychiatry and becomes neurology's pet. I'm being a little flippant there. So Huntington's chorea, they've known for years it was a genetic condition. Somewhere probably in the mid 90s, about when I was finishing a PhD in neuroscience, they actually pinned down the exact gene. It's an autosomal dominant gene. So if you have the gene, you will absolutely get the condition. So people say, well, isn't that a perfect example of genes being everything? And yet, let's say you inherited the gene. So for most people with Huntington's, symptoms aren't showing up till 30s or 40s. There's certain variants and certain multiple repeat copies and certain generations or families. Presentation can be younger and younger. And one of the first, actually the first patient I ever dealt with in my medical school, medical life career was a 19-year-old woman on the psych ward because of her Huntington's chorea symptoms were already manifesting. Anyway, so you have the gene for Huntington's chorea, and you are in a bus crash and die at the age of 19 without displaying any symptoms of it. That means you didn't, you had the gene, you didn't show Huntington's, and in some way it's a purposely ridiculous example, but it's showing, if you don't live to grow up to the point where the gene is expressing itself, even if you have the gene, so it's not completely under genetic control, even though if you had lived long enough, it would show itself sooner or later. So again, and that's one extreme, but pointing out, even at the extreme, there's no such thing as a purely genetic condition. So Mr. AKA, and so often Mr. AKA's questions are probably above my pay grade and expertise level, but I'll try to read it and see. Yes, did I see the recent Mendelian randomization of low CP1A2 activity, single nucleotide effect on body fat, though higher plasma through higher plasma caffeine? Maybe Qelbree can help ADHD through higher plasma caffeine levels too. So Qelbree does seem to elevate caffeine levels through interfering with 1A2. I think there's even some preliminary research or investigative small sample size studies showing that. Certainly theoretically it makes sense. I'm not as aware or how much. I'm not familiar with the research showing C1P. So C1PA, C1A2 is one of we used to call them P450 liver enzymes that affect the metabolism of many drugs. And Qelbree is a blocks the activity of 1A2. Caffeine is a substance that's degraded by 1A2, and therefore Qelbree, viloxazone, boosts plasma caffeine levels. I'm just not as aware of the research on how that regulates body fat levels. Um, So Max, and I'm not referring, because I've mentioned it a couple times, didn't quite get my example of homosexuality in the DSM. And Max's understanding that homosexuality was originally included for being a pathological deviation of perversion paraphilias, not for social distress. I would argue that's exactly social distress. It's saying society is distressed by this. So my point was that all of our discussions, and I would say it's maybe harder to see it in general medicine as well, or often the claim is it's real, it's physical, it's a real condition, but our conditions are in the context of a society that sees them as problematic. So the example was 70 years ago, 80, or 50 years ago in the 1970s, the early editions of DSM, homosexuality was considered a condition or a disease because it was considered by society to be deviant, to be different from what was normal. And some of the studies suggested it was associated with poorer outcomes in terms of higher rates of drug abuse, depression, suicidality. I would argue most of the research since then suggests that that wasn't something inherent in homosexuality that causes depression or these other conditions. It's a society stigmatization. But I would say our DSM, our psychiatry is always working in the context of a given society. So I'd say it was accurately reflecting societal views and that people with homosexuality were having more life problems. Again, if the life problems were ultimately stemming from society behaving badly, I would agree. But I don't think it was a necessarily, I would say it was more a failure of the times. Should you say, should psychiatry be ahead of the times? Maybe, probably. But in some way, it should represent what it's a product of its society. Maybe I'm not still articulating that clearly, so maybe follow-up is still warranted. So Jen asks my thoughts on Sunosi for ADHD, and the doctor is considering adding it along with Adderall. So Max will probably pull it up. So I do have a talk on Sunosi. It has, my recollection, it's only approved right now for narcolepsy and daytime sleepiness through sleep apnea. It has phase 3 testing that shows that it can be helpful in ADHD. I don't know how close to being approved for that it is, whether it makes sense to combine it with Adderall or not. I have a separate video on combining medications. So the Sunosi is a dopamine and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So in some ways, it resembles some aspects of Wellbutrin, bupropion, or methylphenidate. So whether many people are getting additional benefit or not, but again, even if it lets you have a lower dose of Adderall, that itself may be a positive reason for combining. And again, the information here is for general purposes only, not making specific recommendations for your individual situation. So James Alexander asks, what are the differences between Wellbutrin SR, not IR, and Wellbutrin XL when it comes to ADHD? So I do have a whole video on Wellbutrin, and this has been one of my pet peeves over 30 years, is how many pharmacists have completely got it wrong, and it's completely misleading. So and we're talking here specifically about brand name, because when you go from brand name to generic versions, you do not have to use the same method of delivery, slow release delivery. You just have to approximate the profile release. So like 99% of most of our slow release drugs across medicine, the slow release mechanism for Wellbutrin SR is the matrix of the material that the drug is locked in, so it dissolves slowly. There is a small surge, it's not a huge one, within the first hour or two of taking it, and then it's more slowly, after that sort of initial amount is dissolved or released or absorbed, then it is slowly, the pill itself is slowly dissolving as it's going through the early stage of the digestive system, and that's releasing it as a slow, at a regular rate, over about 12 plus hours. Of note, so when Wellbutrin IR was approved for depression, it was approved as a 3 times a day drug, so it has a fairly short half-life. Peaks, boost dramatically. Many people took Wellbutrin at bedtime as their third dose, even though the commonest side effect with Wellbutrin is disrupt sleep, but lots of people could get away and sleep on it. When Wellbutrin SR, when the patent on Wellbutrin immediate release was coming to a close, they said, oh, let's make this a slow release molecule, and we can simplify things for patients and make it a twice-a-day medication. So they did that, and then when Wellbutrin SR's patent was about to expire, they came out with Wellbutrin XL, extended release. So XL uses a very different technology to release the medication. It uses osmosis. So, and this is a simplification of schematic. There's a permeable but hard outer shell. Within that outer shell of the drug, there's a salt component and there's a drug component. When, by the power of osmosis, when the capsule, the pill, is in your body, the salt component sucks water or pulls water by osmosis into that hard outer shell. And as the salt component expands, that means it's condensing the container or the amount that's with the drug in it, and it's pushing the drug out through pores that are designed to be exactly the right size for a very steady release. So there's no small initial surge with the XL, or shouldn't be, because again, it's just the force of osmosis pushing things out. It's very steady. And they got FDA approval as a once-a-day drug. That's a big benefit in terms of patient simplicity. But the profile of release of XL versus SR is really quite similar. It's not that XL is delivering steadily over 24 hours. That's completely wrong. But what happened was, once it got entered into the pharmacologic databases as the SR is a twice-a-day drug, the XL is a once-a-day drug, that got flipped or interpreted by the systems as that means one is a 12-hour delivery and one is a 24-hour delivery. They're not. It's just simply wrong. Again, the SR, there's a little more surge. So, and two different aspects here. When you're using it for depression, what's really clear, the antidepressant effects of Wellbutrin are slow and gradual and start accruing over several days to a few weeks, like the SSRIs, like the tricyclics, like the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, like most of our traditional antidepressants up until the last few years. The thinking, and if I knew how this worked, I'd be world famous, and I'm not. So nobody knows exactly how our antidepressants work, but the thought is how they're messing with serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake receptors is serving as a signal to the brain. That's telling the brain, hey brain, make some new proteins, move those proteins from cell bodies all the way out to the end of nerve cell terminuses, probably termini, probably make new nerve cells, All of those are processes that take days and days to build up and work. So it's not that you need the level of the drug in your blood to reach a steady state. It's not that that's slow. It's that the processes that's being initiated that alleviates depression or anxiety is slow. So what we know with slow indirect processes is you do not need exactly 24/7 coverage. You do not need to be as you would with an antidepressant or with I'm not an antidepressant, antibiotic or an anti-seizure agent where the drug is working in that moment. And if it drops, then you're not killing bacteria or you're not preventing seizures. Antidepressants are slow indirect, so it does not matter that you are not getting perfect 24/7 coverage. So we know with the even relatively shorter acting drugs that are recommended for twice a day, many of them work just as well for depression if they're once a day. So Effexor, there's studies showing even the immediate release once a day works as well as a twice a day. Probably works better because fewer doses get mixed. This is a long answer. So, on the other hand, the benefits for ADHD seem largely, maybe not entirely, but largely dependent on what's going on with dopamine and availability and norepinephrine availability. So, those are direct, immediate effects, sort of like the side effect of feeling energized. So, the difference between XL and SR, so the XL does in some people last a little longer. So, the concern there for ADHD is you may need to be a little more careful that you take it early enough in the day. It may last in some people an hour or two longer. So if you were used to taking the SR at 10 a.m., you may need to be taking your XL a little earlier. And the other thing is, particularly given that the morning is a difficult time for people with this ADHD, actually having a little bit of a surge in the first hour or two is often beneficial. So I've seen SR be more often useful than the XL in ADHD, not a huge difference. And then the third angle or tied in with that, I'm losing my train of thought. That initial surge. Yeah, there was another half-baked reason. Oh, no, that's a completely distinct reason. The other reason I would prefer SR, particularly starting out to the XL, is that the SR, like most slow-release tablets that are not dependent on the integrity of the outer membrane, you can break it in half and get a half dose. The XL, you cannot break it in half to get a half dose because of two different factors. One is the drug is not evenly distributed, so half a pill probably doesn't contain half the dose. It contains considerably more or less. And two, breaking the XL completely destroys the slow release mechanism and turns it into an immediate release drug. So, and again, those are all true and valid for the brand name formulation. But I was shocked when I learned, if you make a generic XL, you do not have to have an osmotic delivery system. So I would think it would be important to preserve that mechanism because, as I've just pointed out, in a few situations, it's important. So hello, Larry, and thanks, Max. Max just put up the link for the Sunosi video. And appreciation Jen has extended to me and to Max. Max is at Flenna. Yeah, so Max is pointing out whether DSM should be labeling that the distress is induced. So when it used to be included whether the distress was caused by the underlying homosexuality or whether the cause of the distress was society's reaction to that. But there's some people who would say, agree with, we would look at schizophrenia and say, with schizophrenia, we're not denying that hallucinations and delusions are part of that condition and are part of what makes those people different from other people, and are part of what. But they would argue that what leads to dysfunction and distress is how our society is treating those conditions. And if we were in a different culture, which led someone to say that this is a shaman or someone with magical properties to foresee the future or a respected oracle, and we just need to be able to decipher it, then the exact same behaviors are not leading to distress or dysfunction, because most of distress and dysfunction is how our society has organized itself in opposition to people who behave in different ways. Um, so Larry is commenting on the intersection of PTSD and ADHD, and asks, do I think it would be better if we don't talk about traumas during ADHD diagnosis? Does that help mitigate the chance of being misdiagnosed for PTSD? Same for BPD, borderline personality disorder. My sort of flippant answer is a good, thorough, thoughtful diagnostician. I mean, one is that any information that's potentially pertinent should be, so in an ideal world, pertinent information should be included, and a astute, compassionate, good listening evaluator will take the different pieces into consideration and formulate different hypotheses and come up with good follow-up and feedback questions to try to elicit, are your symptoms coming from ADHD? Are they coming from PTSD? Are they coming from both? Because again, having one does make it more likely you do really meet the other. On the other hand, in the real world, my experience is that there are certainly a considerable and growing quite considerably group of therapists who are trauma focused, and everyone who comes in the door, everything that's going on is blamed on trauma. And in fact, many of them flat out say ADHD doesn't exist, it's all trauma. If you have good evidence, if you have good family history, if you have a good tracking of symptoms pre-existing any apparent traumas that you're aware of or any major trauma, if you have things like thoughts bouncing around constantly that aren't worrisome, negative, traumatizing thoughts, if you have, again, lots of your own experiences that you probably have ADHD separate from any PTSD, the simple answer is don't go to someone who identifies himself that way. And it works the other way too. There are ADHD experts or specialists who sort of myopically only see everything looks like ADHD. And again, ADHD symptoms are common, or prefrontal cortical executive function dysfunction is there in lots of people with depression. It's there in lots of people with anxiety. It's there in lots of people with schizophrenia and autism spectrum. So I'd say the risk or danger I'd see is more going to someone who's wedded to a diagnosis before they see any people. And unfortunately, and many of them are well-minded. They're sincere. They believe in what they're doing. That doesn't make them right, though. And if they're not right, then it's not going to be helpful. If you genuinely have ADHD and you're only being treated for trauma, that's not likely to be thoroughly helpful. And again, I've cited cases where misdiagnosis has killed people. Mental health misdiagnosis, missing ADHD. And I'm not, so even with glasses, I'm not going to, Zio Halo, thanks me for the videos. Are there any body blood tests that are normally taken before getting a diagnosis in either ADD or any mental diagnosis concerning vitamin deficiencies, gut bacteria? I'll start with the easy end of it first. So with gut bacteria, I mean, we're certainly in the early ages of sorting out the importance of the microbiome of the gut and skin and other parts of lungs too. It's not just in the gut. There's lots of gut nerve interactions and connections, Right now, it's simply at this stage. I mean, one is even when we're characterizing the gut microbiome, usually at most we're looking at a few dozen of the most common or popular species. So when we're characterizing, I mean, it's sort of like identifying this is a white pine forest or this is a birch maple forest, that may generally get a gestalt assessment, but what if what's important is whether there are any sycamore trees growing in that forest or X, Y, or Z. So when we're assessing microbiomes, particularly gut microbiomes, almost always we are not giving a detailed breakdown on all the bacteria forms that were there. So at this stage, even though there are some general correlations, people with this general profile are more likely to have this condition. One is most of it seems correlation. There is a study with ADHD and looking at gut, I think it was gut bacteria in early infancy and looking later and showing at least it had some predictive value. So not just an association, but that doesn't mean cause and effect. In terms of other blood tests, and I'm not going to be comprehensive. I mean, again, a good history is the most important clue because, yes, is it possible that hyperthyroidism can lead to hyperactivity, and that could lead to looking, if you're too hyperactive, you could be restless and distracted and other symptoms. Yes, but most often you're displaying other signs of hyperactivity in terms of, I mean, if it goes far enough, there's sort of extra, your eyes are bulging out, changes in skin, hair, sweating, heat tolerance. Um, so most of our, so that a good history is our best indicator, but yes, there are blood tests for thyroid for certain vitamin deficiencies, including D and some of the B vitamins, for anemia, which can show up in psychological ways. I'd say, again, most of the time in my experience, I'd say it's been shockingly few. I'm not even recalling any cases that I can think of in the hundreds of patients I ever worked with where a blood test showed or revealed a condition that wasn't already being detected. I mean, including somatic bodily conditions that were contributing to a mental health condition. So James Alexander asks, how fast do you titrate Wellbutrin up, SR up in a standard patient? So standard for depression, and actually it's Zyban, which is Wellbutrin, a slow release form of Zyban used in the US for smoking cessation. The standard titration is a week at 150 and then go up to 300 at the end of the week. So most people can tolerate going up pretty quickly, but a sizable minority of people are sensitive, particularly to feeling too revved up, too agitated. Wellbutrin can also affect blood pressure. So what I usually say is start with this, again, a standard dose is 150 for starting. There's some people who start at 300. There's some people who start at 100 SR and break it in half because they need a lower dose and they're really sensitive. So, but what I'd say, start at the dose. And if you are free of side effects for 3 or 4 days in a row, then it's almost certainly safe to go up to the next higher dose. So, and with Wellbutrin, I should point out there are, it is one of our psychiatric drugs where there's a caution about going too high because doses of the immediate release above 450 were correlated with greater risk of seizures. With immediate release, your blood level is going much higher than it is with this extended releases, or either form of extended release. And it's actually questionable whether what is truly the safe level. I mean, I think the safe level is probably substantially above, and I've seen it edged down to 400 in certain formularies, which is no sense at all given the FDA has approved a 450 XL version called 450. But I've seen pharmacies say, and the electronic warning system say, you shouldn't go above 400 for a daily dose of Wellbutrin. It's not what the FDA thinks. Anyway, I'm getting close to the end, but there's a few questions. So Beth, and I think if it was you who brought up the issue of the bone cell growth, thank you. Beth LM, roughly how long could one expect the fatigue side effects of guanfacine to last after each dosage increase? Her son slept for 4 hours at school on day 5 of increasing to 3 milligrams. Yeah, I'd say if he's sleeping for 4 hours in school, I mean, one is, I'm presuming he did get a good night's sleep that night. 2 is there's a lot of individual variability. And for some people, the time course of, I mean, one, it depends a lot on whether it's an immediate release or an extended release form of guanfacine. Some people take their doses in the morning, some take it in the evening. I usually dose it as an immediate release in the evening because that seems to consolidate most of the sedating effects into the evening. I mean, the claim was the extended release would sort of spread everything out so there'd be less sedation. But I've had more people who had daytime sedation problems with an extended release than got from an immediate release. And again, as we were talking at the antidepressant discussion, there is good research on both immediate release and extended release guanfacine being effective for ADHD. The only FDA-approved product is an extended release form. But again, there is good data that the immediate release is effective. And getting back to the analogy with the antidepressants, most of guanfacine's impact for ADHD is indirect. So the binding action on the alpha-2 noradrenergic receptors is slowly having effects on synaptic growth and connectivity and how glutamate and dopamine are processed and working in the prefrontal cortex. So there's not, I would argue, the presumption that we need absolutely steady states because the benefits for the drug are not dependent on the dose of the drug in your blood at a given time. On the other hand, side effects often are directly related to how much is in your drug. The drug is in your blood at a given time. So it may be useful to experiment with the timing of the drug and or whether an immediate release or extended release is more suitable. And Beth LM asks, are there any new studies on insights into the default mode network and its significance to ADHD? And I would say yes, and it's not a simple picture. So that's where I will leave it at this, given I have about 1 minute left. Yeah, so Beth is sort of following up that at least it wasn't sleep deprivation or problems with sleep, which led to her son's sleeping during school. So that's good. Again, in a general informational view, it may be that it could be that for him with this formulation of this drug, the biggest sleepy period or sedative effects are hitting 15 hours afterwards. But if that's the case, then theoretically, we should be able to adjust the timing of the medication. Now, if it's happening throughout night and throughout half the day, then adjusting timing won't help much. And the other thing to remember is we have our own circadian rhythms with propensity to falling asleep. So separate from drugs, separate from medications. But your likelihood of falling asleep is greatest in the evening when it's normal bedtime. And I have a talk on siesta time. There is a siesta lull in alertness. So again, the same level of drug in their blood may have a bigger impact at 1 or 2 in the afternoon because it's combining with the normal tendency to fall asleep at that time. So thanks for being here. Thanks for asking great questions. Thanks for putting up with lengthy explanations. I will be back next week. Won't be in Hawaii. Both of my twins are graduating from college this week, different cities. So I'm not even sure where I am next Tuesday, but I'll be here. And thanks, Max, for helping with the stream and providing good questions and the links. And he has and he has a link to the Reddit. I think next week we will have the Zoom link for the Manhattan ADHD presentation, which is May 29th at 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks. Stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll be here next week.